we had litigated this very issue with Bill Clinton. Back in early part of this year, when this issue about the president tearing up records and throwing them down toilet bowls, or him actually having to turn certain records back to the archives because they were, quote, presidential records, I remember thinking, and I tweeted as such, that what's going on here? This is a complete change from our understanding of what the law is. Why? Because we had litigated this very issue with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, after he had left office, we found out that he had kept 78 or 79 recordings, tape recordings of his activities as president. There was an author who was, I think, in his residence, or maybe it was in the Oval Office, or both, it doesn't really matter. And he wasn't just interviewing Bill Clinton, and these weren't his just casual thoughts. These tapes were documenting his presidency in the sense they captured him, according to reports, communicating with foreign leaders, members of Congress, etc. And we had seen that material be publicly disclosed somehow. And back in 2009, back when I was a little kid, we asked for them under I believe the FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act. We may have invoked the Presidential Records Act because of the intersection between the two. And I won't get into too much complexity on that, but essentially the PRA, once the records become part of the Presidential Records Act process over at the archives and are processed, they're subject to disclosure under law. And the disclosure requirements are similar to FOIA. So it's all kind of bound up in the same approach in terms of public disclosure. So our thinking was, well, how is it the president can take records with him that evidently relate to government decision making and just say they're personal? And we thought that the Presidential Records Act and the law generally required the archives to go and get them. And this is what happened. The Justice Department, who represented the archives in the case we pursued, said, nope, you can't do it. You can't force them to do it. The president has the right to have the records. They're presumptively his because he didn't transfer them over at the end of his presidency, so we just presume them to be personal. I want to say that again. The lawyer for the archives told the federal court judge that because a president had certain records after the presidency that he had not turned over to the archives at the end of his presidency, they were presumed to be personal. Now, did they tell that to Judge Reinhardt down in Florida when they went in there, waving their arms, waving their hands, saying, oh, he has presidential records, oh, he has classified records? I doubt it. I doubt it. And you can bet that's why they don't want to turn over to Judicial Watch and to you, the American people, the full explanation, the full background as to what they told the judge there, but I'll get into that later. So it was Judicial Watch that fought this issue, and we lost. And so it comes up again this year where they're making this argument that he has presidential records he has no right to. And I was thinking, based on what the government had previously said and this important court decision, that was a lie. They were misstating the state of the law. They were misstating government policy. And I want to explain to you more about this Clinton sock drawer case, as I call it, because it really blows out of the water the idea that President Trump did anything wrong in keeping these records. And, you know, the irony is, on top of that, is the reports are he was still being nice and accommodating and turning over records, you know, pretending, I don't know if he was pretending or not, but at least acceding to the government's argument, well, these are presidential records. And he's like, okay, well, take them. They're classified. Okay, take them. My argument is he didn't have to do either. And if I were him, I would have said, look, these are my records. I understand why you may want some of them for historical purposes, and I'm happy to give them to you. but it's a voluntary disclosure of my personal records related to my presidency. And of course, you know, the Justice Department knew this was an issue, or they should have known, because A, they litigated the case against Judicial Watch. This was a big case. It wasn't that long ago. The decision was 10 years ago. Judicially, that's not that long ago. And it was in the District of Columbia, so it wasn't obscure. And it was by Judge Amy Berman Jackson, one of the leading court. I think is she the chief judge now? Maybe not. Well, anyway, she's a liberal on the court, and she's been around for some time. And I want to read to you some of the material from Judge Amy Berman Jackson's decision, and we'll link to it so you can read it in full. And she provides the background, because I'm reading this to you directly. It's because it just, as I said, you can see why, given this decision, just how corrupt the raid on Trump was in terms of providing evidence that there was no good faith basis for the raid. According to plaintiff, Judicial Watch, President Clinton enlisted Taylor Branch to assist him in creating an oral history of his 8 years in office. In 2009, Branch published a book entitled The Clinton Tapes: Wrestling History with the President, based upon extensive conversations with President Clinton during his tenure in the White House and the events Branch observed when he was in the president's office. Plaintiff avers that from January 20th, 1993 to January 20th, 2001, Branch recorded 79 audio tapes that preserved not only President Clinton's thoughts and commentary on contemporaneous events and issues he was facing as president, but in some instances recorded actual events such as presidential telephone conversations. Based on Branch's book, plaintiff contends that the recordings captured a verbatim record of President Clinton being president. The complaint alleges that the tapes captured a wide range of presidential matters, including potential changes to his cabinet, including whether to fire then CIA Director James Woolsey Jr., or whether to nominate Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State. Foreign policy decisions such as the United States military involvement in Haiti and the contemplated relaxation of the United States embargo in Cuba. I forgot that Clinton invaded Haiti. Jeez, talk about an area worthy of further investigation. But I get distracted. But just Google Clinton and Haiti, you'll see what I mean. President Clinton's side of telephone conversations with foreign leaders, members of the United States Senate and Cabinet Secretary. So the side of telephone conversation with foreign leaders, that typically is material that is inherently classified. President Clinton speaking to several members of the United States Senate, in which President Clinton attempted to persuade the senators to vote against a specific amendment before the Senate. President Clinton's side of a telephone conversation with Congressman Bill Natcher of Kentucky, in which the president explained his reasoning for entering into the North American Free Trade Agreement, based on technical forecasts that he received during presidential briefings. That sounds potentially classified. President Clinton's side of a telephone conversation with the U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher concerning a diplomatic impasse over Bosnia. So all of this is not only obviously related to government operations that are significant in terms of potentially educating the American people about what President Clinton was doing and thinking, but it's on their face, some of it would have been typically classified and would have had to be declassified in order for Americans typically to gain access to them. And all we wanted the archives to do was go get these documents and process them according to law. It didn't mean they would be forced to release everything they had, because I said there are some certain limits as to what we can get. But this is what was being disclosed. And the court told us we should jump in the lake. I'm joking a little bit there, but that's essentially what the court found. The categorization of the records during the presidency controls what happens next. And she was talking about how the Presidential Records Act presumes that the president is the one denoting what is a presidential record and what are personal records. At the conclusion of the president's term, the archivist is directed to assume responsibility for the custody, control, and preservation of and access to the presidential records of that president. The archivist is required to make such records available to the public as rapidly and completely as possible, consistent with the provisions of the Presidential Records Act. The statute, this is key, assigns the archivist no role, again, no role with respect to personal records once the presidency concludes. So let me be clear. Under the law, no one but the president gets to pick what's presidential records. No one but the president gets to pick what are personal records. And the archivist, which is being used as a cutout for the anti-Trumpers in running our government here in D.C., has no authority to second-guess him. In fact, the only limited judicial review of the presidential records decisions are basically a kind of a transparency analysis that certain records are being designated as presidential records when in fact they're just regular old FOIA records that can be released more quickly and more easily. There's no court decision, except this one, as best I can understand it, that give the archives or anyone else in an agency, any other agency, including the Justice Department or the FBI, any authority to second-guess the president here. As I said, a lawyer for the Justice Department, I've got the transcript here, you can look it up, said that because the president, in this case Bill Clinton, did not transfer the material, they're his, they're personal. Again, further in the decision, the PRA requires the president to maintain records documenting the policies, activities, and decisions of his administration, but leaves the implementation of such a requirement in the president's hands. The Presidential Records Act is on thin ice constitutionally. The Congress recognized that, look, the president has prerogatives as president of the United States, head of the executive branch. We can't come in there and manage his day-to-day operations. We can try to make sure that certain records that are created on behalf of the American people that document his activities officially are kept, a la the Federal Records Act. But we can't come in and say, oh no, you should have kept that one as a presidential record and you can't have that one as a personal record. Because that gets too much into the heart of the operations of the White House, which constitutionally is a separate branch of government. But they've blown all that up right now by pretending they can go in and raid his home based on this very dispute. Unbelievable. It's really troubling that a court would have allowed this to take place. The court notes that at the outset that there is broad language in a decision called Armstrong 1, which is a District of Columbia Circuit decision, meaning it was an appellate decision that governs this court decision that we're talking about here, stating that the PRA, it's a Presidential Records Act, accords the president virtually complete control, quote, virtually complete control over his records during his time in office. In particular, the court stated the president enjoys unconstrained authority to make decisions regarding the disposal of documents. Quote, although the president must notify the archivist before disposing of records, neither the archivist nor Congress has the authority to veto the president's disposal decision. And I would go further. If he designates something as personal, he doesn't have to tell anyone what he's doing with them. He can tear them up. But once the records is designated as presidential, that's when this restriction about disposal occurs. Since the president is completely entrusted, again, this is the court decision here, completely entrusted with the management and even the disposal of presidential records during his term in office, it would be difficult for this court to conclude that Congress intended that he would have less authority to do what he pleases with what he considers to be his personal records. That means storing them in a storage room in the basement of Mar-a-Lago. Don't it? Of course it does. And then, of course, the issue is who gets to second guess the president's determinations. Now, this court is suggesting the courts really can't. In fact, she writes, the court has serious doubts about whether the former president's retention of the audio tapes as personal is a matter that is subject to judicial review. Do you think Judge Reinhart was told that the district court judge that handled a specific case related to a dispute about the nature of records a former president had, that a court found that they had serious doubts as to whether that decision was subject to judicial review? I doubt it. And again, the court further finds the PRA does not confer any mandatory, again, or even discretionary authority on the archivist to classify records. They don't have any business doing it. Under the statute, this responsibility is left solely to the president, while the plaintiffs cast this lawsuit as a challenge to a decision by the National Archives. The Presidential Records Act makes it clear that this is not a decision the archivist can make, and that in this particular case, it is not a decision the archivist did make because President Clinton's term ended in 2000 and the tapes were not provided to the archives at the time. It's exactly the same issue here, isn't it? Of course it is. Another statement by the court. The archivist has no statutory powers related to either the reclassification of records or the retrieval of improperly classified records. I mean, this is pretty damning stuff, isn't it? I think it is. And this is why I've been so insistent about it, and this is why the left has been so angry with me and Judicial Watch for highlighting this beginning in the first part of the year, because I've been talking about this, I've been tweeting it out, and at one point the leftist fact checkers, who are activists to try to destroy and censor and suppress information and opinions they don't like, they called out all these other experts who pretended that what I was saying was bunk, and it wasn't bunk. It's completely accurate. It's based on our significant experience litigating Presidential Records Act, federal records issues over the course of 30 years nearly. Judicial Watch is the nation's, I would submit, leading expert on this topic. And this is what I love. And so the court was making fun of us. I say maybe I'm a little more sensitive than I should be looking at this decision. But she was like saying, well, what is it you want me to tell the archives to do? Raid his home? I don't think even we contemplated that. Maybe if I were arguing the case, I would have said, yeah, raid his home, but our lawyers are more careful than that. Defendant considers this is again, the government of the United States considers what we were asking them to do to be an extraordinary request that is unfounded, contrary to the Presidential Records Act's express terms, and contrary to traditional principles of administrative law. And she said, "What you've asked me to order them to go get them." She quotes herself from the transcript here. And our counsel at the time, and he's still with us, Michael Bekesha, he said, yeah, to the extent we asked the court to require them to assume custody and control of the tapes. I mean, it sounds awful that they think we're asking for this court to bang down President Clinton's door and seize these audio tapes. Archives could make a phone call. They could write a letter. There's nothing in the records stating that President Clinton wouldn't just give them the records. We're not specifically saying they have to go seize. And she said to us in response to Michael's good faith offer there, there's ways of trying, at least beginning to get the records. Plaintiff's indulgence in wishful thinking in order to minimize the ramifications of its own lawsuit underscores the lack of redressability in this case. So she's telling us, look, there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing I can do about it. The law doesn't give the archives the ability to do anything about it. And because the law is the governing statute here, it unlikely gives anyone else the ability to do anything about it. One option is they can call President Clinton and ask. our lawyer said. Okay. He says, no. Now what? The court says. They write a nice letter, which is exactly what they were doing with Trump, and Trump was being accommodating. And yet they raided his house anyway. Something that the lawyers here for the Justice Department never contemplated. The court ruled out, practically speaking, and was contrary to virtually every understanding of the Presidential Act and the deference given to a president in terms of what he's able to do with his own darn records. Case closed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.